I have worked in the same archive for 24 years, and in that time I have learned one thing about quiet. Most people do not actually want it. They want the appearance of it. They want a room that looks like a quiet room, with low light and orderly shelves and the soft sound of turning pages. But what they actually want is a version of the room that asks something of them. That performs something back. That acknowledges their presence and reflects it in a way that feels correct. The Keth Sorval Compact Diplomatic Transit Archive does not do this. It is a reading room in a transit station, which means it was built by people who needed somewhere to put the records and only afterwards noticed that records require a room. The shelves are an older alloy, the kind with the faint copper undertone that marks station construction before the second expansion. The reading tables are heavy and plain. The light panels run at 70% because they were calibrated for document preservation, not atmosphere, and nobody has ever filed a request to change them because the people who work here understand why the calibration is what it is. I am the only person who works here. My name is Eden Koss, and I have held the post of Station Archivist, Grade 7, for 24 years at this posting and 31 years in the classification. I am 58 years old. I have read every document in this archive at least twice, most of them more than that. I know where everything is without looking. I know the sound the third shelf makes when the temperature differential between the corridor and the reading room produces a 1-degree variance in the alloy. I know that the chair nearest the east window panel has a slight list to the left that becomes noticeable after about 40 minutes. And I know this because I am the one who has been meaning to file the maintenance request for it for 6 years and have not done it. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand what the room was before she arrived. It was ordinary. It was a station archive in the middle of a diplomatic transit week, and it was quiet, and it was mine, and nothing in it was arranged for anyone in particular. She came in on the 4th day of the diplomatic review period. I did not hear her at first. The archive's entry threshold has a soft pressure indicator, not a chime. Just a change in the reading room's ambient air that I have learned to register over 2 decades as the difference between a room with 1 person in it and a room with 2. I looked up from the transit bond cross-reference I was indexing, and she was already inside, standing 3 meters from the door, looking at the shelves. She was small. I say this not as a description of her age. I do not make estimates of age for the children who pass through this station, because the Velthorin developmental rate does not follow compact standard, and I am not qualified to guess, but as a simple statement of her physical presence in the room. She came up to the height of the second shelf. She had silver-blue skin of a quality I had seen in 3 prior Velthorin delegations, a particular undertone, more blue than gray at the temples, lighter at the jaw. Her eyes were large and pale amber, with the slight vertical extension at the outer corners that marks the inner line houses of the second province. Her hair was silver-white, cut in the close formal style that the Velthorin keep for children in official delegation status. She was wearing a transit stay coverall in the soft gray of a compact courtesy issue, with a small house line designation embroidered at the collar in dark blue thread. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the shelves. I went back to the cross-reference. For approximately 4 minutes, neither of us said anything. Then she walked, very carefully, to the reading table nearest the north wall, the one furthest from my desk, pulled out a chair and sat down. She had to pull the chair out further than most people do because her legs, at that height, needed more clearance to sit comfortably. She managed it without making more than a small sound. She put both hands flat on the table in front of her. She looked at the surface of the table for a moment. Then she looked up at the shelves again. I got up from my desk. I went to the reference section on the north wall, the periodical transit bond digests, which I had been meaning to reorganize by amendment cycle rather than by issuance year, and I pulled down the stack I needed and carried it to the reading table next to hers. Not hers, the adjacent one. I set it down, sat, and began sorting. She watched me for a moment, Then she looked back at the shelves. That was the first afternoon. She came back the next day at the same time, the day after that as well. By the sixth day she had established a pattern. She arrived in the early afternoon, always within a 15-minute window, always through the main entry rather than the corridor side door. She always chose the same table. She always put her hands flat on the surface first. She never brought anything with her, no materials, no personal items, no reading. She sat in the reading room the way you sit in a place where nothing is required of you, which is to say with the specific quality of stillness that is different from waiting. Waiting leans forward. What she was doing leaned back, very slightly, as though some internal structure that had been held taut was, in this room, allowed to ease. I did not ask her what she was doing there. The archive is a public facility in a compact transit station. Any resident of the station, any member of a docked delegation, has access to the reading room during posted hours. I did not ask her name. I did not ask which delegation she belonged to. I could make an informed guess, given the houseline embroidery and the diplomatic review week, and the limited number of Velthoran delegations currently in station. But an informed guess is not the same as knowing. And I do not ask questions I am not authorized to ask and do not need the answers to in order to do my work. What I did was work. The transit bond cross-reference had been waiting for 6 weeks, and it did not become less necessary because there was a small person sitting at the north table. I completed the index corrections for the third cycle amendments on the afternoon of her second visit, and moved to the fourth cycle on the afternoon of her third. On her fourth visit, I was working through the pre-accord correspondence requiring a condition assessment, which meant I was handling documents at my desk for most of the afternoon, which is closer work than cross-referencing and requires a different quality of attention. She was at her table. Neither of us made much sound. The archive's ambient hum, the climate system, the light panels, the small steady sound of an old building occupying itself, filled the space between us the way it always does. On the sixth afternoon, I noticed she was watching my hands. Not in the way people watch to be intrusive, not with focused attention or any sense of wanting to be caught watching. She was watching the way you watch something you are trying to understand the mechanics of, the way a person reads a posted diagram while their hands are doing something else. I was handling a pre-accord instrument, a designation document, one of the older formats that use a folded triple seal structure rather than the flat compact standard, and I was working through the seal structure carefully because 3 of the 4 folded layers had partial adhesion, and forcing them would damage the outer membrane. She watched me work through this for approximately 6 minutes. Then she went back to looking at the shelves. I did, on the 7th day, move the reference station nearest her table 6 inches to the left so that the shelf edge was not between her sightline and the north collection. It was a minor adjustment. The sightline to the north collection is one of the better ones in the room. The alloy of those shelves has a warmer tone than the south, and in the afternoon the light from the west panel catches it at an angle that makes the older documents legible at a distance. I had noticed her looking at it. I moved the shelf. She noticed. She looked at the shelf, then at me, then back at the shelf. She did not say anything. On the 8th day she asked me what was in the section with the red designation marks. I told her. Pre-accord diplomatic correspondence, the original instrument copies rather than transcriptions, filed by issuing house rather than by date because, when the collection was established, the archivist at the time believed house provenance was the more durable organizational principle, and subsequent archivists, myself included, had not found a compelling reason to reorganize on a different basis. She considered this. Then she asked why the red marks. Designation color corresponds to access tier, I said. Red means restricted consultation, not restricted access, but restricted handling. Those documents can be read by anyone with reading room privileges, but they cannot be removed from the room, photographed, or transcribed without a written access request, submitted through the station administration office. She looked at the red-marked section for a moment. Then she said, "Does anyone ask?" "Not often," I said, "but occasionally someone does." She nodded, as though this had confirmed something she had already estimated. Then she went back to looking at the shelves, and I went back to my desk. That was the first time she spoke to me. Over the next 3 days she asked 11 more questions. Not in sequence, not the questions of a person working through a structured inquiry, but the questions of someone who notices things and asks about them, when the noticing produces a gap she wants closed. Why was the East collection organized differently from the West? Whether the archive maintained its own climate system or drew from the station main. What the small glass case on the corner of my desk contained. Whether I had read all of the documents. The glass case held a Velthorin transit instrument seal from the 3rd cycle of the pre-accord period, given to my predecessor by the delegation that established this station's diplomatic designation, and left to me when he retired. She came to my desk and looked at it without touching the case, which was the correct instinct. The case is sealed, and the seal is not to be broken outside of a formal conservation context. She looked at it for a while. The seal is a flat disc of compressed mineral compound in the Velthorin 2nd province color, dark blue with a silver inset mark at the center. The mark is the house designation of the delegation that gave it. I told her this. She asked which house. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is my mother's house." "I know," I said. She looked at me. It was not a suspicious look or a surprised look. It was a look that was recalibrating something. Then she said, "You knew before." "I knew from the house line embroidery," I said. I had not confirmed it from any other source until this moment. She thought about this, then she went back to her table. On the 9th day she asked me whether I had read all of the documents. "Yes," I said, "to that last one." "All of them." "All of them. It takes a long time. You have many years to read in an archive." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have not read very many things yet." "That is the appropriate state for someone your size," I said. She looked at me. It was one of the more precise looks I have received in 24 years, which is a considerable sample. Then, after a moment, she said, "My mother says the same thing differently." "I imagine she does," I said, and went back to my work. She came in on the 10th day and sat for a while, and then she asked me what I liked about working here. I thought about this. It is not a question I am asked often. The people who visit an archive come with specific purposes, a document they need to consult, a record they need to verify, and the archivist is a function to them rather than a person with opinions about the work. This is not a complaint. It is simply accurate. "I like that it is the same work every day," I said. "The materials are different, but the work is the same. The work is, understand what something is and where it belongs and how to preserve it. That is the work every day, and it does not change, and this seems to me like a reasonable way to spend a working life." She thought about this for a while. Then she said, "My mother's work is different every day." "I imagine it is," I said. "Is that better?" she asked. "I don't think better is the right word," I said. "I think it is a different thing. Some work benefits from variation. Some work benefits from constancy. An archive benefits from constancy because the materials require a person who understands their history, and you cannot understand the history of a collection of documents if you are only present for part of it." She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "Do you ever leave?" "Not during working hours," I said. "After working hours?" "I have a residence in the station residential wing," I said. "I go there and return in the morning." She appeared to consider whether this constituted leaving. She decided, apparently, that it was ambiguous. She went back to looking at the shelves. On the 11th day, she asked me whether the things in the archive ever got lost. "No," I said, "not if they are catalogued correctly." What if they are cataloged wrong? Then they are still present but unfindable, which is a different problem than lost, but produces a similar result. It is one reason the work of recataloging is ongoing rather than finished. A catalog is a living document. It requires maintenance the same way the materials do. She thought about this for a long time, longer than she usually thought about things, which was already longer than most people. Then she said, "What do you do when you find something that was cataloged wrong?" "You correct the record," I said. "You do not discard the previous classification. You add a notation indicating when the correction was made and what the error was, because the error is also a record. It tells you something about the state of the archive's understanding at the time it was made. Then you refile the item correctly. Then you update the finding index. Then you verify that nothing else was misfiled under the same error logic, because errors in cataloging tend to be systematic rather than individual." She was very quiet. I had the impression that she was not, at that moment, thinking about documents. After a while she said, "What if the error has been in the record for a long time?" "The correction is the same," I said. "The duration of the error does not change the procedure. It may increase the volume of downstream corrections required, because a long-standing error produces a longer chain of misfiled items and inaccurate cross-references. But the procedure is the same. You find the error. You correct the record. You verify the scope. You refile everything that belongs elsewhere." She nodded, very slowly, the way she nodded when something had arrived in the correct place, inside whatever organizing system she was running. I went back to my work. She went back to looking at the shelves. The archive held us both without comment, the way it always does. The diplomatic review had been running for 10 days by then, and I will tell you what I had observed of it from the archive, which has a corridor-facing window panel that I keep at 30% opacity during delegation hours because the light is useful, but the corridor traffic is not relevant to my work. I had seen the formal progression of the review past the window 4 times. The Velthorin delegation in full house dress, the second province house colors, dark blue and silver, moving with the coordinated deliberateness of people who have rehearsed their public presentation. The Queen was tall. I had seen her twice in the corridor, once at closer range when the review session paused outside the archive door for approximately 3 minutes, and I had continued working while the delegation spoke with the station administrator. She had the quality that people of that rank usually have, which is not exactly authority but the expectation of authority, a way of occupying space that is prepared for and calibrated to an audience at all times. Her daughter in the archive reading room had none of this. What her daughter had in the archive reading room was the absence of it. The absence of the calibration, the absence of the preparation, the absence of the expectation of an audience. She was a small person sitting at a reading table with her hands flat on the surface, looking at a room that was asking nothing of her. I have observed, over 24 years of working in a transit archive during diplomatic review periods, that the children of delegations exist in a particular condition during formal reviews. They are not participants. They are too young to be participants in any substantive sense, but they are also not free of the review. They are present in it the way furniture is present in a performance space, arranged for the event, carrying the weight of the event's requirements without being given a function in the event itself. They absorb the sustained performance mode of everyone around them without being told what to do with what they are absorbing. I have seen this before. I had not previously thought about it in any particular way because it was not my work to think about it. I am an archivist. My work is the documents. But I had been thinking about it over those 10 days. In the intervals between tasks, in the particular quality of attention I had been paying to the table at the north wall. On day 11, I left a periodical transit bond digest on her table, not as an offering, not with any statement or gesture that would transform it into something that required a response from her. I was reorganizing the digest series, and the volume needed to be temporarily housed somewhere while I cleared the shelf, and the table nearest the North collection was the logical place to set it, and she happened to be sitting at that table. She looked at it, she pulled it toward her, she opened it to the first page and began reading. She read for 47 minutes, which is longer than most adult visitors read in a single session. When she left, she carried it to the return shelf beside the entry door and placed it precisely in the center of the shelf, spine out. The next day she came in, went to the return shelf, took the digest back to her table, and resumed where she had left off. I noted the volume number and made a retrieval record in the archive log. It is standard practice. All document consultations are logged. I noted the time, the access classification, the document identifier, and in the patron column I wrote visiting delegation member, junior, which is the standard classification for non-credentialed access under 12 compact years of age, and which I would have written for any patron of that status regardless of house line or diplomatic designation. She came in on the 12th day and found the second volume of the digest series on her table. She looked at it, she looked at me. I was writing a re-indexing notation and did not look up. She sat down and began reading. The diplomatic review entered its formal assessment phase on day 13, which meant that the corridor outside the archive was more actively trafficked than usual, with station administrative staff moving between the assessment rooms and the delegations, formal quarters in coordinated sequences that are familiar to me from prior review periods. I have been at this posting for 24 years. I have seen 9 diplomatic review periods. I know what the traffic patterns look like, and I know what the faces of delegation staff look like during the formal assessment phase, and I know the difference between the composure that people carry into a room they have prepared for and the composure that people carry in a corridor between prepared rooms. The corridor composure is thinner. The corridor between prepared rooms is where people allow themselves the face they actually have. What I observed through the 30% window panel on day 13 was that the Velthorin delegation's corridor composure was under more sustained pressure than is typical. I am not qualified to interpret the diplomatic specifics. That is not my work. But I can read a corridor the same way I can read a room, and what I read on day 13 was a delegation in formal performance mode that had been in formal performance mode for 13 days and was beginning to show the cost of it in the way that sustained performance always shows the cost. A slight thinning of the margin between the presentation and what is underneath it. The child came in at her usual time on day 13 and sat at her table and opened the 3rd volume of the digest and read for 61 minutes. Before she left, she asked me whether the archive had a collection of pre-accord cartographic materials. Yes, I said. West section, 3rd and 4th shelves, organized by system rather than by date because the cartographic designations changed across the accord periods and date-based organization, would require a cross-reference index that the cartographic designation provides more efficiently. She absorbed this. Then she went to the West section, found the 3rd shelf, and spent 8 minutes looking at the materials without touching them. Then she came back to her table, replaced the digest on the return shelf, and left. On day 14, I moved the cartographic collection's access notation card from the shelf edge to the reading table, where it would be at a comfortable height for someone of her dimensions. The card contains the consultation instructions, which materials require the written access request and which do not. I moved it because it is easier to read when it is at reading height. This is standard archive practice. The card should be at reading height. I filed the maintenance note to myself to move the card permanently, which I then did, so that future patrons of any height would have the same access. She found it on day 15. She read the card, she looked at me. I was recataloguing the 4th cycle correspondence, which requires the kind of focused attention that makes looking up a measurable interruption to the work. She went to the west section and spent 26 minutes with the cartographic materials, handling each one with the two-handed grip that the consultation instructions specify for documents of that weight and dimension. She did not need to be told. She had read the card. When she left that day, she paused at the entry door. She did not turn around. She stood at the door for approximately 3 seconds, then went through it. I noted this in no record because it does not belong to a record category. It is the kind of thing you notice in a room you have occupied for 24 years, which is how a door sounds when someone is deciding whether or not to say something, and decides not to and leaves. On day 15, she had also asked me something I have been thinking about ever since, which I did not mention in the correct sequence, because the question came at the end of the cartographic session, and I had already begun to describe what I was thinking about on day 16. And the archive, as I have said, organizes by provenance rather than by date, and sometimes the order that things actually belong in is not the order in which they arrived. She had asked me, "Do you have a family?" "I have a brother on the second outer ring," I said. "We correspond." "Does he come here?" "He came once," I said, "in my 5th year. He looked at the shelves for a while. He said it was quiet." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "My mother does not come here." "No," I said. "She is busy," she said. It was not a complaint. It was the tone of someone accurately describing a condition of their life. "Queens tend to be," I said. She looked at me. She had done that look before, the recalibrating look, the one that was checking something. Then she said, "You knew and you never said." "I know many things I don't say," I said. "It is one of the requirements of the work." She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "What are the other requirements?" I described them. She listened with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered to her, which was a different quality of attention from the attention she gave to the digests. That was forward-moving, following a line. This was the attention of someone mapping, building an internal record. When I finished, she said, "It sounds like important work." "All work is important when it is done correctly," I said. She thought about this for a long moment. Then she said, "I think my mother would disagree about that." "She might," I said. "She would not be wrong to disagree, but she would also not be entirely right." The child sat with this for a while, which was one of her qualities. She sat with things. She did not rush them into a conclusion. She let them occupy whatever space they required until they settled into the correct place, and then she acted. This seemed to me like a reasonable quality for a person who was going to have the life she was going to have. The formal assessment phase concluded on day 16. I know this because the corridor traffic shifted from the pattern of assessments to the pattern of conclusions. The movement slows, the deliberateness becomes a different kind of deliberateness, and the faces in the corridor between prepared rooms have a different quality. Conclusions have a specific look. The margin between the presentation and what is underneath it either narrows or widens depending on how the conclusion has gone. And on day 16, I observed it narrowing in the Velthorin delegation's corridor, which in my experience means the conclusion has produced something that requires additional performance to manage. I do not speculate about diplomatic outcomes. It is not my work. The child came in at her usual time. She went directly to the west section without stopping at her table first. She pulled out the cartographic volume she had been working through and carried it to her table. She sat down. She did not put her hands flat on the table first, which was the only time in 16 days she had varied from this. She opened the volume. I watched, without appearing to watch, the quality of how she was reading. It was different from the previous days. The previous days she had read with the slightly forward attention of someone following something that is going somewhere interesting. Today she was reading with the flat attention of someone who needs something to look at. The page-turning intervals were irregular, which they had not been before. She was not, I think, taking in very much. After 22 minutes, she closed the volume and put both hands flat on the table. She looked at the table's surface. She sat like that for approximately 4 minutes. Then she said, without looking up, "Does anyone ever stay here a long time?" "Define long," I said. "More than one afternoon." "Yes," I said. "The archive is a transit facility, which means its purpose is to serve people who are passing through, but the word passing has a range. Some people are in transit for a single station rotation, some for weeks. One patron, in my 3rd year here, consulted the pre-accord cartographic materials every afternoon for 11 weeks while his delegation's situational review was being conducted. He became very familiar with the Kethsoval survey records." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "We leave tomorrow." "I know," I said. "The departure manifest is in the station administrative record." She nodded. She looked at the cartographic volume on the table in front of her. She did not open it again. After another moment she said, "I have not finished the digests." "The digest series will be here," I said. "The archive is not relocating." She considered this. I could see her working through the logic of it, which is a specific kind of process to watch, not the process of someone reaching for a feeling, but the process of someone mapping an actual problem and its actual solutions. The digests would be here. She would not be here. The gap between these two facts was the problem. She was calculating whether there was a solution that closed it. I got up from my desk and went to the reference section. I pulled volume 4 of the digest series and carried it to her table. I set it in front of her. She looked at it. I said, "The archive maintains a patron request system for materials that a visiting patron wishes to continue engaging with after their transit period concludes. The request form is filed with the Station Administration Office. The relevant materials are held in consultation status for 1 standard year, during which any patron with the appropriate access credentials, which include a verified delegation return visit or a written correspondence request filed through the station archive relay, can continue their consultation." She looked at me. I had not previously described the patron request system to her because she had not asked about it, and I had not known until yesterday that she was leaving. "Can I file one?" she asked. "The form requires a patron credential verification," I said. "In the case of a junior delegation member, the credential verification is co-signed by the delegation's registered diplomatic liaison." She thought about this. "Who is that?" "For the 2nd Velthorin Province delegation, the registered diplomatic liaison is Kale Voreth Sorn," I said, "whose office is in the Station Administrative Wing, Section 3. She absorbed this. She sat with it for a moment in the way she sat with everything, not impatiently, but with the specific quality of a person letting a piece of information settle into the correct place before deciding what to do with it. Then she said, "Will you help me fill it out?" "That is within my archival function," I said. We spent 18 minutes on the form together. The form is not a complicated document. It is 7 fields, 4 of which are identifiers and 3 of which are specification fields describing the materials requested and the basis for the request. She answered each field accurately and without hesitation, giving her full Velthorin name in the patron identifier field rather than a shortened form, which is the correct practice and not something most adult patrons remember to do. When we reached the specification field for basis of request, she said, "I have not finished reading them." "That is the basis," I said. I wrote, "Patron consultation ongoing, materials not yet completed within transit period. The compact archive standards consider this a valid basis." She read what I had written. She nodded. I printed the form and added it to the outgoing administrative file for the station coordinator to process. I would follow up on the co-signature requirement with the liaison office myself, which is within my function and which I intended to do before the departure window. She went back to volume 4 of the digests. She read for 39 more minutes. She handled each page with the same two-handed care she had applied to the cartographic materials. When she finished, she placed the volume on the return shelf and the cartographic volume beside it, both exactly centered, both spine out, and she went to the entry door. She turned around. She looked at the room for a moment, not at me specifically, but at the room. The shelves and the tables and the light panels at 70%, and the small glass case on the corner of my desk, with her mother's house seal inside it. Then she crossed the room. She walked from the entry door to my desk, which is approximately 9 meters, and she walked it in the direct line without breaking stride. And when she reached my desk, she stopped for approximately 1 second, and then she put her arms around me. She was small. The top of her head came to my collarbone. Her arms were thin, and they reached around me to about the middle of my back, and she held on with the specific pressure of someone who has calculated exactly how much is appropriate and has chosen to use slightly more than that. She smelled of the Velthorin station-issue transit soap, a compound with a faint mineral quality that the compact import register lists as standard for delegation courtesy kits of the second province. I put one hand on her back. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The room was already doing what it does, which is hold things without comment. After approximately 8 seconds, she let go and stepped back and looked at me. Her expression was the expression of someone who has done the thing they decided to do and is now checking whether the outcome matches the prediction. I did not know what outcome she had predicted. I only know what I gave her, which was my hand briefly on her back, and whatever my face was doing, which I cannot fully report because I have never been good at monitoring my own face. Then she turned and walked to the entry door and went through it. I sat down. I am not a person who sits down unexpectedly in the middle of a working day. I have a task list that runs, on most days, to 20 or more items, and I work through it in sequence because the sequence is efficient, and because the archive has enough material to occupy me completely if I let it. Sitting down in the middle of a working day, without a specific task that requires sitting, is not something I do. I sat down for approximately 90 seconds. Then I went back to the recataloguing. I did not know at that point that the Queen had been in the corridor. She had come, I learned later, as part of the formal departure protocol. The senior members of a diplomatic delegation are expected to make a courtesy walk of the primary public facilities during the departure hour, which is a custom I was aware of in the abstract, but which had not, in 24 years, previously brought anyone of that rank to the archive corridor at the specific moment that it did on that day. The archive's corridor window was at 30% opacity. At 30%, the panel is effectively one way. I can see the corridor in reasonable detail. The corridor cannot see the archive interior with any clarity. This is a standard setting for a public reading room with a diplomatic corridor adjacency, because it protects patron privacy while allowing the archivist to monitor corridor conditions for security purposes. I was not looking at the corridor window when it happened. I learned what had happened from the station coordinator, who came to the archive 40 minutes after the departure, and from Kaelvoreth Sorn, the liaison officer, who came 3 hours after that with the co-signed patron request form and an additional document that I will describe in a moment. What I learned: the Queen had been in the corridor at the moment her daughter crossed from the entry door to my desk. The window is 30% opaque from the corridor side, but 30% opacity is sufficient to see movement and general form, particularly when the movement is the specific movement of a small child crossing a room in a direct line toward an adult. The Queen had seen her daughter do this. The Queen had seen her daughter stop at the desk and put her arms around an archivist she had not introduced to her mother, whose name the Queen did not know, whose function in the station the Queen did not know, in a room the Queen had not known her daughter had been visiting for 16 days. The station coordinator told me the corridor had gone still. There were 14 people in the corridor at that moment: the senior delegation members, the protocol staff, the station administrative escorts. The station coordinator said he had seen a lot of departures in 19 years, and he had not seen a corridor go that still before. He said the Queen stood at the window for the duration of whatever she could see inside the archive, and then she stood for another moment after, and then she continued the departure walk at the same pace she had been walking before, without altering her expression or her posture, and the corridor resumed. He said one of the junior protocol staff had said something in Velthoran. He did not speak Velthoran. He thought it was probably not a standard protocol phrase. Kaelvoreth Sorn came at the 3rd hour with the co-signed patron request form. The co-signature had been obtained with efficiency, less than 2 hours after I had filed the outgoing request, which is faster than the standard processing window. He placed the form on my desk, and he placed a second document beside it. The second document was a letter, written on Velthoran's 2nd Province House correspondence paper, which is a heavier stock than compact standard, with the house designation in the upper corner. It was addressed to the compact archive, Keth Sorval Station, to the attention of the presiding archivist. I will not reproduce it in full because the archive does not reproduce private correspondence without written access authorization. I will describe what it said, which is that the Queen of the 2nd Velthoran Province wished to communicate the following: that her daughter Sale had spoken of the archive reading room with a specificity and consistency across 16 days that she, the Queen, had observed with attention, that she had not known, until the departure hour, the full nature of what the archive had been for her daughter during the review period, that she understood, from what she had seen through the corridor window, something of the nature of what it had been, and that she wished the archivist to know that she was in possession of this understanding, and regarded it as a debt of a kind that she was uncertain how to specify. Because the Velthoran Register has several categories of debt, and she found that the one that applied here did not have a direct translation into compact standard. The closest approximation, she wrote, was a debt owed to a place that held something when it needed to be held, and to the person who kept the place, and these were not the same debt, but they were not separable either. She wrote that Sale had told her, in the final evening before departure, that the archivist had known from the beginning whose house line she carried and had not said so, and had not changed how he treated her after she confirmed it, and that this had struck Sale as the correct approach, and that she, the Queen, having considered it, agreed. She wrote that the Velthoran 2nd Province does not have a formal designation for this behavior in the compact register, but that they have a word for it in the provincial tongue that translates approximately as the act of knowing a thing and treating it as irrelevant, when treating it as irrelevant is the correct thing to do. She wrote that she hoped the archive would be as it was when they returned. She wrote that she intended to see it herself. She signed it with her house name and with her personal designation, which in the Velthoran 2nd Province is a different mark, smaller, written below the house name, in the hand rather than the seal. I have seen Velthoran 2nd Province correspondence before. I had not previously received a letter signed with the personal designation. I filed the letter in the patron records, in the section for correspondence, which is a section I maintain but which has never been heavily used because most archive communication is administrative. I filed it under S, for Sale, because the patron is Sale, and because the archive organizes by patron rather than by correspondent in cases where the correspondence concerns a patron's record. Then I went back to the recataloguing. The patron request form was processed by the station administration within the standard window. Volumes 4 through 12 of the Transit Bond Digest series and the relevant cartographic collection materials were held in consultation status. I noted this in the archive log under Sale's patron record, which I had established on day 8 when I made the first retrieval notation. I updated the record with the consultation hold dates and the anticipated return window. I also noted, in the remarks column, which is a free text field that archivists use for contextual information about patron needs that assist future consultation, patron is thorough, prefers to begin at the beginning of a series and read in sequence, has good handling practice for restricted materials, applies two-handed grip without being instructed, responds well to materials being available at reading height. Sightline to the North collection is preferred. I noted the chair. I wrote, chair at table 4 north wall has a list to the left that becomes apparent after approximately 40 minutes. Maintenance request has been filed. In the interim, the chair at table 3 north wall is structurally sound and has an equivalent sightline. I filed the maintenance request that afternoon. It had been 6 years. 8 months is a long time in an archive. There is always work. The fourth cycle correspondence recataloging alone will take approximately 3 months if I proceed at the pace the materials require, which is the pace they require because they are old and need careful handling, and the indexing decisions are not obvious, and I am the only person here to make them. The cartographic collection has needed a comprehensive condition assessment for 2 years, and the budget allocation has come through twice and been redirected twice, and I have reason to believe it will come through again in the next quarter. The pre-accord correspondence in the red-marked section has 17 documents with compromised binding that need to be flagged for conservation review. The digest series, now on consultation hold, will need the existing index updated to reflect the hold status and the anticipated return patron's notes, which I intend to accommodate by leaving the remarks field of each volume's retrieval record open for patron annotations. A practice I have not used before, but which seems appropriate given the thoroughness with which she was reading, and the likelihood that she will have things to write in the margins of her understanding when she returns and continues. I do not have margins of my own in the archive documents. The archive is a preservation context. But I have, for 24 years, had the remarks column of the retrieval log, and I have filled it with the things that seem worth keeping. The patron who needed the chair adjusted, the collection that worked better with the access card at reading height, the document that required a two-handed approach explained without being instructed. The remarks column is, in its way, the archive's own record of how it has met the people who have used it. Her entry is longer than most. There is always work, and the work is the reason the archive is what it is, and the archive being what it is was why she came back every afternoon for 16 days and sat at the table with her hands flat and looked at the shelves. I think about that, sometimes, in the way you think about things in a room that has been yours for a long time. The room did not do anything different. I did not do anything different. The work was the work, the shelves were the shelves, the light was at 70% because that is the correct calibration for document preservation. She sat in a room where nothing performed, and nothing required a performance from her, and after 16 days she decided that was worth crossing 9 meters for. I have worked in this archive for 24 years, and I have learned one thing about quiet. It is not the absence of something. It is a thing in itself, with weight and dimension, and it holds what is brought into it the way a good room holds everything, without comment, without condition, without asking anything back. The patron request is on file, the materials are held, the chair has been repaired. 8 months is not very long.